My name is Franz, in case I haven't met anyone, but I think I've met everyone here by this point. My presentation is on social reproduction theory and communalism. It's not going to be an overview of feminist theory within social ecology or like that of the history of feminism within like social ecologist movements, because that's not my area of expertise, but I really welcome like contributions and questions from people that have maybe more knowledge in that area and can engage. What it is going to be is kind of an exploration of social reproduction theory, which I'll get into a little bit more, and the ways in which I think its theory is really applicable to like a communalist sort of praxis. So it'll be an exploration of social reproduction theory and its relations to libertarian municipalism, communalism, whatever you want to call that. I think the reason why I kind of made this connection, social reproduction theory, again, I'll define it more in just a second, but I think it does a really good job of informing ways in which we can organize, like do radical organizing for a better society, like outside the workplace and the point of production, and really embeds a lot of those struggles in communities and in households and in other ways. So I have, let's see, go to the next slide. Until 12:30 for this, right? So about an hour. So
12:45.
12:45. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is kind of an overview of what the presentation is going to look like. I'm dividing it into about 3 stages: theory, history, and praxis. So I hope to kind of like have some room for questions and feedback whenever they come up, but especially kind of after each of these sections, if we can do a little bit of question answer discussion feedback. I really appreciate that. I like my presentations to be interactive, so don't ever feel bad about raising your hand, whatever. So within the theory section, I'm going to talk about social reproduction theory, what it means as a framework, what is socially reproductive labor, and how does that relate to labor power, types of socially reproductive activity. Then the history, I'm going to kind of go over these like distinct stages within capitalism where, you know, production and reproduction are organized differently. Some contradictions that reveals about our current economic and political systems, and then going into praxis, which is, for anyone that doesn't know, kind of putting theory into practice, figuring like taking action based on these ideological and theoretical principles. So how can these contradictions that I will identify, how do those inform what our strategy will be, and then get into more specifically like what that means for the practical on the ground, like what we're trying to do on a daily basis. So, social reproduction theory as a framework, what does that mean? So first of all, I want to define social reproductive labor. So this is a term that goes all the way back to Marx, but was really kind of developed further by Marxist feminists later on. Marx focuses primarily on wage laborers as the primary exploited class under capitalism, but kind of throws in this little additional thing that he doesn't develop a whole lot about the role of reproductive labor in the economy and reproducing the working class. So under capitalism, you need to reproduce the workers who are doing this labor and reproduce the conditions that exist under capitalism. So that's done primarily by work being done, unpaid labor being done outside of the factories, predominantly by women in the household, also in public institutions, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Marx tend to conceptualize these as two separate and distinct spheres of the productive economy, as he called it. We've kind of problematized that word a bit in previous lectures here, and I'm going to continue to try and do that. And then the reproductive sphere, which is this distinct sphere that exists outside of the circuits of capitalism that is necessary for supporting it. And I take more of the approach that these are not two separate systems. They're two sort of matrices of social relations embedded on top of each other and like incredibly interconnected. The reproductive sphere, as it's called, is not merely like the non-economic sphere, and then this other sphere is the economic productive sphere. I'm going to try to problematize that distinction a little bit, and especially the ways in which this distinction tends to devalue women's labor, labor that is feminized and oftentimes racialized, which is something I'll get into more later. And also problematize this Something I think social reproduction theory as a framework can do really well is problematize this distinction between exploitation and oppression. So exploitation is generally considered to be it's economic in nature, clearly. It's based on class relations, and typically people talk about workers, and when they mean workers, they mean this sort of idealized white male factory worker. That's the imagery that often comes to our head when we have a Marxist analysis of class, which is drawing on these, 19th century imagery and language. And then there's oppression, which is considered to be cultural, political, interpersonal, and that deals with gender and race. And I want to say that those two things aren't as separate as people think they are, that these relationships that constitute exploitation and class are the same relations that constitute these forms of oppression, and that we cannot just reduce gender and racial hierarchies to the sphere of culture, completely divorced from our broader system of capitalism. And finally, I think social reproduction theory, it provides an alternative framing for how we understand the history of capitalism and the contradictions within capitalism. It tries to kind of turn Marx's narrative on its head of this is how capitalism came to be, this is how capitalism developed, and say let's look at this not just from the perspective of the productive wage earner, but let's look at this from the perspective of a more holistic view of all of the labor necessary to reproduce the capitalist system. Does anyone have any questions so far, or is this making sense? Okay, cool. So within Marx's theories, I guess pause here just a second to say it's a framework heavily steeped in Marxist analysis, and that is a framework I come from a lot. I'm not a Marxist in the sense that I believe in the vanguard party seizing power, but I think Peter said yesterday, heavily on different parts of Marx's analysis. And what I like particularly about this framework is it comes both from a Marxist analysis but also a critique of a Marxist analysis to make it better, more holistic, and not sort of like a crude economic reductionist that a lot of, not all, but some Marxists fall into the trap of. So throughout the weekend, I've heard lots of people talk about human beings are commodified. I'm commodified, you're commodified, we're forced to work, earn wages. And I want to clarify that a little bit as far as a Marxian analysis would put that. Marx's framework is that labor power is the commodity. So labor power would be defined as a human's capacity to do work. So when I get a job, I work for a wage, I'm not selling myself, I'm not literally a slave, I have some agency to choose to not have that job, but I am still within the confines of the workday forced to sell my productive, quote unquote, productive capacity to the boss. And that commodity of labor power is something that has to be replenished. You can't just work 24 hours a day, you have to sleep, you have to eat, you have to take care of your other biological needs as well as social human needs. And so that is the purpose of socially reproductive labor, is to replenish, or that is a big part of socially reproductive labor, is to replenish your ability to perform labor, your ability to sell labor power to the capitalist class. So the ways I'm going to be talking about it in this presentation are going to be heavily steeped in how this exists and is reproduced under a capitalist system. Because right now, our primary reason for reproducing ourselves is so that we can continue to be wage laborers, or for a lot of people that is the case. But that hasn't always historically been the case, and that doesn't always have to be the case. So then I wanted to, again, dive into this question of what is the economy? What is part of the economic sphere? What do we mean when we say production? The way that orthodox economists and mainstream economists talk about the economy is very surface level. They talk about the economy as the market. This is the free market where free individuals come to freely exchange goods and services. Or that's the predominant view, which is really a surface view of what the economy is. The way I view and understand the economy is a more totalizing ways in which goods and services are produced in this social web of social relations. Who's producing what? How is it being distributed? How is it getting to the people that need it? And so this framing of the economy as the market serves to obscure these deeper social relations of domination and hierarchy and exploitation, both within the formal workplace and outside of the formal workplace. This economic domination is maintained through political and social mechanisms, so both through the state as well as, there are these aspects of cultural and social hierarchies that exist in relation to gender and race that maintain and are maintained by a political power. And now, as it currently exists, the productive economy kind of subsumes all the reproductive processes and instrumentalizes reproduction towards the end of, quote unquote, quote, capitalist production. And so I threw this diagram up here. It's like a pretty standard sort of like econ textbook diagram to talk about the relationship between the government sector, the household sector, the business sector. And I just kind of wanted to point out, you see within the household sector, what are they doing? They're getting paid for jobs, they're consuming, right? What does that word consume mean? And they're paying taxes. There is no reference to any sort of labor or economic activity that's actually creating or maintaining something happening in the household. It's all about this kind of passive consumption. So I just wanted to point that out for now. So types of socially reproductive labor. So now that I've kind of delved into the basics of this framework, what does it mean to actually do labor that is socially reproductive? So I think this exists on kind of three distinct levels. The first, the kind of most obvious, I think when you say like reproduction is like physical, like biological reproduction. So that means like birthing children, breastfeeding, the sort of like, we have to physically create these biological entities that are human beings at the most basic level. And then there's socially reproductive labor that serves to replenish immediate labor power. Labor power in the immediate sense of doing domestic labor, cooking, cleaning, in the traditional sense we think of like, the white man comes home to work to his, heterosexual nuclear family and his wife is there cooking and cleaning and providing him meals. It can take lots of different forms. It's not always like that. But anything that serves, you can be a single person living on your own and you come home from work and cook yourself dinner. Like, these sorts of labor that are domestic labor, care labor, outside of the workplace is what I mean by immediate labor power. And then there's replenishing and restoring and maintaining generational labor power. So this one's a little bit more amorphous because it's, processes that take place over generations. So that means child raising, not just childbirthing, but the process of, now raising that child into adulthood and everything that comes along with that, which under capitalism includes a lot of ideological education. You have to teach children, and children oftentimes have to teach themselves how to exist in this capitalist world by becoming capitalist subjects, by becoming ideal workers, by being molded into someone that can fit within this capitalist society. And that is a function that social reproduction plays in our current world. So this is done, both in the household and in the school system. In the household, like mothers teach their daughters how to be a woman, like how to, this is what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to wear makeup, you're supposed to do these things, you're supposed to find a man and get married, and all of these things. Little boys are taught how to be men, like the social role that they're expected to fulfill. We're all taught, our role as workers, if that is, the background you're coming from. Because children are future laborers under capitalism, and in many cases present workers under capitalism, depending on those social contexts. In the US, child labor is not such a big thing, but plenty of teenagers have jobs, and these contexts are going to be different, depending on the context. So children are at first merely kind of objects of their mother's reproductive labor, especially, or not, I'm not saying mothers, of someone else's reproductive labor. Typically we view it as a mother caring for a child, but, babies aren't able to take care of themselves. They're completely at the whim of someone else, and then this is kind of a transformative process of children growing up. They are self-transforming, and that's being influenced by all of the different social factors around them, including their nuclear family, whatever family structure, the public education system, etc. And also, as part of this generational labor power is how we conceptualize elder care in our society. Obviously, elders are more past laborers than future laborers, and so in a lot of cases, when there's like a consolidation or a crisis or a lack of capacity to do reproductive labor, elders are the ones that get left out or forgotten about or neglected. But within a well-functioning, system of reproduction, like that is a category of people that should have access to care and reproduction. So then I've been talking about the household and the community a lot. So throughout the history of capitalism, the household and the family structure has been sort of the primary site of individualized reproduction. And it's the primary site of unwaged reproductive labor that is not compensated in any way except for maybe having access to someone else's wages through a marriage relationship, for example. The state also, to different extents throughout history, has provided some socially reproductive either services or payment for social reproduction, if you can think of it that way. So by, food stamps, for example, that's not the government cooking you dinner, but that's the government paying for your food to some extent. So in the cases of like public health, government paid for health care, any sorts of parks or community-based leisure facilities, and pension programs or social security. Those are all sorts of types of state-subsidized social reproduction. And then we see there being an overlap of reproduction happening in the quote-unquote productive sphere, so any places where this is wage labor. So we see that, for example, in public schools, of teachers being kind of both productive and reproductive workers. Any sort of domestic workers, people whose jobs either within a private household or in some community setting are providing care services, cooking, cleaning services, those sorts of things. And then I just want to throw out there for now, because I want to get into this more later, but right now all of these are all very individualized notions or are tied up in statecraft. And so I want to put out there that it's, we should start to think about and talk about how can we start doing these necessary processes in a way that doesn't support and reinforce capitalism and doesn't rely on capitalist institutions and relations to occur. How can we create these participatory social and political relationships where everyone's reproductive needs can be addressed in these non-individualistic ways? So that's the end of my theory section. So I want to give people a chance to maybe ask questions, comments, any additions. I would really appreciate that. If anyone has any.
Just a quick comment. This is resonating with me. Notion you mentioned at the end that discard of that type of labor and doesn't count in the economy.
Yeah, it's not measured anywhere.
No, and we can see, and then your reference to institutions that also reflect this. So teachers also being undervalued in other institutions.
Yeah,
well, what's interesting too, and this is my nonprofit bias, is that the nonprofit space is heavily disproportionate women in all roles, and that same lens is applied. But that's not the real economy.
Right.
I mean, you see the same thing, and then it's interesting that if you look at labor in the nonprofit sector, it's heavily majority women, right? Which is totally reinforces that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's not something I really talk about much, but I think that's important. No, but that's like a great addition. Yeah.
Can you give some examples of reproductive labor in the communal sphere?
I think we're gonna get more into that in my sort of like praxis area, but I think that's something that's by and large like not developed. But you can look at the history of like social movements Actually, I'm going to pass this now that I'm thinking about it. This book I just finished reading recently. It's a collection of essays by different, primarily Marxist feminists writing in this sort of socially productive tradition. I'm just going to pass it around in case people want to take a look at it. But one of the essays in there is called Without Reserve, and they go through a sort of history of U.S. capitalism from the framework of social reproduction. And they talk a lot about tenants organizing in New York in the late 19th, early 20th century, and they talk about these working class, primarily women, getting together and forming these communities where they are taking care of each other's needs. You also see that, I know lots of low wage precarious workers who can't afford childcare, but they have such wacky schedules at Target or wherever they work that they can get together with their 3 other coworkers that have children and say, we hardly ever overlap our shifts, we're all going to take care of each other's children. So these are still ways in which there's kind of self-organized reproductive labor happening beyond the individual sphere, but still in service of capitalism, because we still exist within this capitalist framework, and they need childcare so that they can go to work and sell their labor power. And so we see these small examples exist. But I think having a conversation about what are ways in which we can organize this that goes beyond just sort of maintaining ourselves and actually reproducing ourselves past capitalism is a good conversation, exactly the kind of conversation we need to be having. Does that help?
Yep.
Cool.
Absolutely.
Would you, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Would you consider some of the projects that Dan was talking about in Lower East Side, community gardens? And
Absolutely,
centers,
yeah.
That sort of stuff? And did they have a vision beyond capitalism, in the end, they were trying to organize that towards it?
Their vision was really for a self-reliant community, and I wouldn't say that they were consciously, well, they were anti-capitalist, absolutely, but I don't think they had a full-blown vision of a anarcho-communist society, but we're able to draw also on cultural traditions of mutual aid and the family assistance thing, very good example. There was always an extended family or even a neighborhood that a block that would keep an eye on the kids.
Right.
Financial assistance, hometown clubs where people would lend money to each other without any interest. And of course, in the housing sphere, there was also that same sort of self-help ethos. So, some good examples there, I think.
Yeah, I think a lot of sort of movements take this on without having necessarily that understanding, that reasoning behind it. Any sort of the Black Panthers had their free breakfast program. That's absolutely part of that. Any community-based organization that's seeking to feed people, clothe people, provide these sorts of services are, to one degree or another, trying to communally organize reproductive processes.
Is healthcare, Amy, you had it.
No, I mean, my mind kind of takes this in a little direction, so if you're still following up on this stuff.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to ask, is healthcare part of that as well?
Yeah, I'd say definitely.
There's our see the book.
I would also point out or add to all of the things under there is that a lot of our recreational time is also been subsumed into the economic system in a way that is about social reproductive labor. So particularly around ideologies. So the way when we spend time watching TV or movies or listening to music. All of those kinds of activities are also part of social reproduction, and that as you are supposedly consuming entertainment, that you are engaging in the labor of learning and developing and reproducing the ideology that those are trying to communicate with you. So that there's that's part of the kind of unpaid labor we're all engaging in as well, even our fun time.
Right, yeah, and I want to say, one, fun and leisure is absolutely a form of social reproduction in the sense that, I mentioned this earlier, we have, basic biological needs, but we also have uniquely human social needs that, you can't just like continue to go to work every single day if that's all you're doing. Like, that's a miserable life. I mean, maybe you can, but most people are striving for something beyond that. And so having, ways to have fun and have leisure in the way that we have access to that a lot right now is through sort of this commodified media, commodified fun, commodified leisure, which is then, selling us on this capitalist ideology. So it's kind of like this self-perpetuating, like, we need this, but it's the only thing we have. This form of it is the only one we have access to, and it's reinforcing the ideology that says this is how it should be. So then, getting into history. I'm going to talk about a few distinct stages of economic organization that have been identified under capitalism, and try and point out that these social relations, as they're constructed today and how they've been constructed historically, are not accidental, but are developmental in the sense that each kind of step or change is in response to the existing conditions, and that the form they take today has historical logic behind it. For example, the gendered exploitation of women isn't coincidental. It's not just because a lot of men in 2019 decided to hate women and make them suffer. It's, takes these particular historical forms that were necessary to the way capitalism developed. I'm not making a claim that it's absolutely necessary to capitalism in the abstract, but to the way that capitalism exists today is in relation to how it historically developed. So we can go all the way back to, enclosures in England, enclosures anywhere, but at the beginning of capitalism necessitated that areas that had common ownership of any sort of land. So even within the feudal system, there was, some land that was held in common and open to peasants, to anyone to use communally and access communally, and capitalism sort of necessitated that be closed down. Because with the commons, people had access to independent means of subsistence, independent from capitalism and from the capitalist class. There was no need for workers to sell their labor power to the capitalists if they weren't reliant on that wage. And so capitalism wasn't this, as the economic textbooks like to sell us, this simple, slow process of people voluntarily working for wages because it was a mutually beneficial relationship. It was this long, violent process of taking and enclosing land, and also socially and economically punishing people that didn't conform to that. Another book that I didn't bring but is really good is by Sylvia Federici, if people have heard of her, called Caliban the Witch, where she really details the sort of violent history of the beginning of capitalism and tries to document the anti-feudal struggles and anti-capitalist struggles that were happening right at the birth of this new economic system, and particularly ties it to the oppression of women and this sort of new social role that women took on under capitalism, and relates it to the witch trials. It's really good. I won't get into it more than that, but you should look into it. But so with these enclosures and workers being cut off from the means of subsistence, they become reliant on wages in order to afford to buy food and clothing and everything else that you need to reproduce yourself. But because this was the beautiful era of liberal, competitive, unregulated, free market capitalism, or whatever they say about it, the result was wages just were not enough to subsidize reproduction. The working class was stretched incredibly thin. They were expected to reproduce themselves without any sort of state or community assistance, because all of these other, all these communal social relationships that might have previously existed had been systemically crushed in order for people to be reliant on wages. And so this led to somewhat of a moral panic amongst the middle classes, particularly in England, where there's kind of a microcosm of a lot of these early capitalist movements and developments. So they were afraid that the family was being destroyed. Like there was all these like women and children working in the factories, and women were turning to like sex work or prostitution, and that was seen as something like a moral problem that needed to be solved, and these degenerate working class people need like some like social fixing. And so one of the responses to that was labor protection laws. Like I'm not claiming that this was the only reason that labor protection laws existed, but particularly laws that tried to limit the role of women and children within the factory or within wage labor, which then kind of solidified this tying of women to the household and this nuclear family form as it would develop, which really exacerbated this particular kind of oppression of women. Obviously, patriarchy and the oppression of women existed like long before capitalism, but this represented a reorganizing of the way that patriarchy was structured and the types of relationships that men and women had, and the type of social power that existed within the household, of men having dominance and more access to resources over both women and children. So the same process is what degrades what is seen as women's work as being seen as less necessary, less central to the economy, and makes women reliant on specifically men's wages for access to reproduction. So this, that was one fix, the creation through various laws and social processes over the period of time to create this nuclear family structure, with the man being the productive wage laborer and the woman being the household domestic laborer, was this proposed fix to the crisis of reproduction. I'm going to get into the modern crisis of reproduction, but in a lot of ways we can kind of draw parallels to this past crisis of reproduction. So that was the dominant fix that was put forward. And obviously it did not solve the crisis, especially during this time period of like the late 19th, early 20th century. Wages were not sufficient to support reproduction still. And in addition to that, the economy was unstable enough that employment was unstable. People couldn't necessarily bet on having their job in the long term. There's lots of economic crises and inflation, deflation, whatever is going on, which is making it really hard for wages to be dependable in this process of social reproduction to occur. If you notice, these sort of stages I'm going to go through are very parallel to the way people talk about stages within the productive economy. So there's going to be a lot of parallels there, but I'm primarily going to focus on the reproductive sphere and how it relates. So the next kind of attempt to diffuse the crisis was, what we call state-managed capitalism or social democracy, or this kind of era of New Deal, Keynesian, whatever. So in this context, the solution was that both state and corporate entities would take on and subsidize some of this process of social reproduction. Through the state, this is seen through social services, and welfare services, and job guarantee programs. And from the corporate capitalist sector, that's seen as the predominance of the family wage. So that's the idea that whatever wage you are paying to a man, that's not just going to him, but that's going to his wife and children as well, and so that they can continue to stay in the household, and women can do women's labor, and children can go to school, or depending on the context, also be doing labor within the household. This era, both in the reproductive and the reproductive framework, we see a prioritizing of long-term stability of capitalism over the short-term profit, at least for the time being. But this was mostly, or to a large part, the result of a class compromise, a response to working class movements forcing these secessions. The capitalists didn't willingly say, oh, we want you to have a better, we want the working class to have a better lifestyle, to have more fulfilling lives, or anything like that. It was a strong working class movement that threatened to disrupt capitalism at its root, and that was scary enough that they decided to compromise. That's the form of analysis I use when looking at this time period. People can have some disagreements about how exactly this period of time came about, but regardless, this sort of class compromise and subsidizing of social reproduction was still predicated on American imperialism in the US context. It was predicated on racial hierarchy, and it was predicated on a slightly reorganized but still existing gender hierarchy. So women's role was slightly elevated in the sense that it was viewed as important to pay men enough so that women could have access to their wages, but they're still confined by and large to the household. I do want to recognize that there have been women working in wage labor positions throughout all of this time period, and to the extent that that's true, a lot of it is racialized, especially in the US context. Black women, immigrant women were expected much more to participate in wage labor, and it was necessary for them to. And a lot of that labor was wage reproductive labor. So you see a lot of domestic workers working in wealthier, middle-class, white house homes as childcare providers or nurses or cooks, maids, etc. And so this period of time is an improvement in a lot of ways over the previous crisis and complete lack of any sort of subsidizing of social reproduction, but it's organized through the state, which has its own particular goals and orientations of maintaining capitalism. It built on top of these other hierarchies that exist, and is ultimately, is not the solution. It's not the goal that we're striving towards. I just want to make that really clear. It's attempted to kind of shackle the market just a little bit, tie it to social reproduction to emphasize that a little bit more. But if we were our goal should always be to be transcending the market, not just making it work towards our benefit. Yeah. Moving on. So now we have neoliberal capitalism, which I put a bunch of question marks by, because I know everyone says that's a buzzword and we shouldn't use it or whatever, but I will defend it. So we see sort of, the rise of neoliberalism in the late 1970s, early 1980s. In that historical context, there was a declining rate of profit in the manufacturing sector. U.S. hegemony was faltering. We see a shift towards financialization of the economy, a privatization of social services, and a shift towards privatizing industry more broadly, and a shift in the strategic orientation of an organized capitalist class that had kind of been had a bit more social controls put on them over the last several decades, and we're finally kind of in response to a series of economic crises and lots of other factors that I'm not going to get too deep into right now. We're able to put forward this new strategy for managing crisis and disciplining workers and consolidating their power within and over sort of the existing capitalist state. This was able to happen in large part because the lack of any sort of strong left opposition or organized labor that was able to counter that ideological and economic move effectively. Neoliberalism can be seen both as an attack on production and reproduction and the workers that do those things. The decline in state welfare coincided largely with women being expected to enter the workforce in much higher capacity than before. these decreased social services. So these, women entering the labor force, all of a sudden, productivity is increasing at, not a steady rate, but increases generally over time. Like all of a sudden, there's nearly twice the workforce in existence. There's no, radical organized labor movement to speak of, and wages start to decline significantly over this period, or stagnate. Real wages are declining, so adjusted for inflation. Standard of living falters, and the expectation is that families have 2 earners rather than 1. So there's this, the notion of the family wage, the notion of the family wage no longer exists, which is a complicated institution or complicated form because, on one hand it provided for women within the household, but it still shackled us to household labor. So it's kind of, helpful in some senses, but reinforcing these gendered and capitalist hierarchies in another way. So, but we don't have it anymore. So, with 2-earner families, we by and large see this doesn't mean women taking on less domestic reproductive labor at home. Feminists often use the term the second shift, which is the idea that women go to work for a wage for 8 hours, and then come home and do it all over again at home. There's lots of studies that try and break down like how many hours of household labor men versus women do, and in like the heterosexual family units, women are still doing a vast majority of childcare, of cooking, of cleaning. Those statistics are going to vary based on, location and all of that stuff. But Google that. It's and I think a lot of people don't even realize that division exists. Yeah.
I think now we talk about the 3rd and even the 4th shift.
Yeah. You want to talk?
Yeah.
Oh, no problem.
Oh, I don't. I mean, I've heard of those, but I don't know them very well.
I think the 4th specifically refers to the emotional work.
Yeah, affective labor.
Is that right?
Affective labor is the silly term for that,
Affective
emotional
labor.
work. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also something that David mentioned that much is how nowadays the households are more balanced, but it's still most of the times the women who organize.
Yeah. I think that's what the 3rd shift responds to, right? Is political organizing, community organizing.
Yeah.
That's how I've heard it. Yeah.
Yeah. So this organizing, this thinking, what should be what products should be what, and what should be done in houses, like also.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Thank you for that. Yeah.
to add
Please.
on, like, so it's not just, like the effective and organizational labor involved in like the work that we do, like, as in community work, but that just the very fact of like, in a household, like, one where the in sort of like traditional like male-female like household relationship, that even if the man is taking on like additional and more, or what seems to be like equal labor, there's still a kind of management role, and that women are like having to direct that and think about like all the time, like what, okay, what needs to get done, now I need to delegate some percentage of this over here and some percentage of this over there, and so it seems like other people are like taking on this other stuff, but now there's the additional task and the additional labor of like managing it.
And sometimes it's easier to just unload the dishwasher than it is to pester your partner to unload the dishwasher or whatever it is, but
Anyway,
that's a small
did
aspect.
did I accurately describe what you're talking about also? Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to repeat you, I just...
No, I think you added something really valuable. Definitely.
In the same way that you're describing the shift from managerial state-led capitalism to neoliberalism, a big part of that was this critique of bureaucratization and management. A friend of mine in Germany has written some really interesting stuff about how now that same critique is being played out in families, primarily by men, criticizing women using what's called the artistic critique of alienation, that you're a micromanager, you're too much like a boss, the old Fordist era hierarchs. So it's kind of taking this book I mentioned, this New Spirit of Capitalism, that like how these 60s energies of like I gotta be free now as women have entered the workplaces, they oftentimes make more money and they take on these managerial tasks, that there's a neoliberal revolt against their newfound authority and power, and the men often are taking on the like more artistic and creative roles, and the women are reflecting the values of the workplace in this kind of strange inversion.
Interesting. Yeah, so with all of these factors, with women being in the workforce, having less time to do this reproductive labor, and wages declining, we're seeing less and less capacity for like reproduction to actually occur within the working class family, which harkens back to this earlier 19th century period of capitalism. And there's kind of within the field of social reproduction theory, there's kind of two prominent analyses. One is that it's more or less a return to these sorts of older relations. This is like, viewpoint is a little, it's not widespread or adopted anymore. It's heavily critiqued by this other analysis that says, this is a distinct moment in time, obviously. We're not back in the 19th century. There's so many new forms of relations and factors that didn't exist back then, and so we can draw on some of what happened in the past to inform how we analyze this, but that we really have to be approaching it from a new framework or a new understanding, and taking into account these new variables that didn't exist before. So some like distinct characteristics of this crisis as opposed to that 19th early capitalist one would be the rising precarity of service sector jobs. I kind of briefly mentioned Target earlier, or that's just one example because I've been seeing a lot of memes on Facebook about Target workers organizing, so that's why it's in my head. But any of these sorts of non-productive jobs, right? We think about the economic sphere, the job wage sphere as being productive, but now there's this rise of work that is oftentimes focused on just participating in this process of consumption. Like at Target, you're not producing commodities, you're just getting them that last step to someone so that they can consume it. Or working in like the restaurant industry, which is a form of reproduction. Lots of care work, in-house care work for both elderly and disabled people is a really big sector of the economy right now that is incredibly underpaid and incredibly dominated by not only women, but by and large by like LGBT people as well. Like it's oftentimes for like trans people the only place that they can find work, because they're excluded based on these exclusions of transgender people from jobs. Like you don't want to hire a trans person because you don't think they look enough like a woman or whatever, and so you can relegate them to these household jobs where they're out of sight, out of mind. And so recognizing that division of labor as well. There's also the issue of so-called surplus population, which I absolutely hate this term because people are not surplus, but they're unnecessary to the productive economy. We have populations on the increase, which is not a critique of the population, but it is a statement that we don't need everyone to be working 40 hours a week. Productivity levels are up, the amount of people in the workforce is up, and yet we're just continuing to create these jobs. I really like David Graeber's bullshit jobs idea, where the capitalism necessitates we continue to create these jobs, whether or not they're actually useful or beneficial, so that people can earn wages to support themselves, because we wouldn't possibly think that people could survive without putting their 40 hours a week in. So I think these differences and unique things about our current crisis is an important conversation, because it can help inform how we're responding to the situation and what our political strategies will be.
I don't know if this falls under the term from neoliberal capitalism, but I wonder if because even in my own experience working, like particularly in the service industry and restaurants, there's this big narrative like that we are a family, or that they like try to infuse care within the workplace itself. And so even like you may not be getting that like at home, right? But at the workplace you can. But it's nothing ever like super substantial.
Yeah.
We wanted healthcare, so they gave us like free yoga classes.
Right. Yeah. Very awesome. I want for yoga class, but it's not a substitute.
Right. There's this. It's a way of really like stifling a lot of like even conversations around even the exploitation you may be feeling in the workplace.
Absolutely.
Because people are like, but our boss treats us well. They see us as a person, or like you know. So I don't know if that's a part of it, or like.
I think that's a huge part of it. Yeah.
Real quick, like often like the restaurant industry, like conversations I've had about like our labor conditions are like, well, at least we're not being verbally abused.
Most of the time.
Yeah, most of the time. By our boss, not the customers.
That projection of family onto these kinds of relationships also happens. It's a marketing tactic, you know. So not just with workers, but also with customers. So like when I worked in marketing, like I worked in loyalty marketing, where it was all about creating this kind of like artificial community and generating these sort of fake people, who would communicate in these personalized ways to the customers. Through our acquisition of purchase data and stuff like that. But it was all like around this idea of like creating like, a Walden Books family or the Borders family, like, so.
It's just, yeah, like you guys have been talking about, just sort of makes me think about how it's, I don't know, like the actual data on this, but it just seems to me like our actual intimate, like social reproductive, like necessary relationships are being sort of replaced by these superficial ones, or like whether it's the workplace or like marketing or like social media or something. Like it seems like the actual necessary human need for deep intimate relationships is being replaced by these superficial like family workplace chant Walmart relationships.
Right.
I don't know.
Because our capacity to reproduce ourselves within the context of the family, which is these personal intimate social relations, is being degraded. Like there's not capacity to do it, there's not enough money to do it, there's not enough time to do it, and then there's no real, there's not a whole lot of viable existing alternatives, because even that family model of reproduction is limited in the sense that it's predicated on gender hierarchy. It's very individualistic and isolated from this wider like communal context. So even that is being degraded, like let alone these more holistic approaches that could potentially exist.
I don't know if you plan to talk about the migrant workers in the care work sector.
Not a whole lot. I didn't have time to fit it in, but it is. I try to touch on it when I can. But do you want to speak on it a little bit?
Yeah, I don't know if in that book they touch that topic that much.
Yeah, there's definitely a whole essay on that. It's sprinkled throughout.
So they speak about how this care work or affection work,
Affective labor?
Affective labor.
affective labor has been displaced to migrant workers. I think that's very interesting if we try to establish a link with social ecology, because that speaks a lot to the hierarchization of society. Also, following business comment, I think they, for example, I've seen in Europe a lot how these migrant workers not only do the care work, they also do the affection work to the elders, the affection that they do not receive from their own families. So,
Yeah, thank you for that contribution. Yeah, so all of these things being said, we're really like when I talk about this crisis that's happening, people feel that, people know that, like, you know, you're all contributing your own knowledge and personal experiences with that crisis. And I think it's really important to root that crisis in not just this sort of current moment of neoliberal capitalism, but within capitalism more broadly. Like, we see an intensification under neoliberalism, and so it's really easy to, you know, blame just that, but we need to recognize like a deeper critique of like capitalism and statecraft broadly, and how these crises are endemic to this system, and they may flare up during certain points in history, but we really need to be like at the root of the problem in order to try and solve this. So we talked about this a little bit, this service sector economy, the feminization of a lot of, you know, quote unquote productive labor, in these terms that we've been talking about. And this crisis, I put a few more examples on here, also takes the form of expensive rents that people can't afford, gentrification, contaminated water. Look at Flint, Michigan, that's a crisis of reproduction. Increased prison population, to the extent that you know, prison populations are taken out of the labor pool and the typical reproductive sphere, and their reproduction is to some extent state-sponsored, but, you know, in exchange for their literal freedom and being locked in cages. You know, the increased prison population coincides with the rise of neoliberalism, in large part because of this quote-unquote surplus population that exists. And these are all issues that are intimately tied in with this crisis of reproduction. So, yeah, I'm going to go through quickly some, four different sort of contradictions that I think this mode of analysis has revealed historically in capitalism. So the first is the need for endless accumulation within capitalism, demands, in order for, you know, profit to be realized and the productive process to continue, capitalists need to have a market, need to have people to sell their products to, so that can be realized. And if wages are declining, there's less capacity for the working class to buy these commodities, which means that profits might fall. And so it's like this sort of, these two inherent factors within capitalism are coming up at odds with each other. Then there's this one, which is a little bit convoluted, so let me know if this doesn't make sense. But I promise you it does make sense. So typically, historically in capitalism, we really only see an increase in wages after like organized struggle by workers pushing for that. The capitalists don't like hand that over easily. And so workers push for higher wages because they're really pushing for a higher standard of living. If that's successful and this higher standard of living is achieved, that corresponds to more commodities being purchased, which responds to, you know, economic boom and economic growth. Whenever economic growth happens, that means productive capacity is increasing, and it means the value of labor power is actually being pushed down, because if you can produce the same amount for less labor, that means you have to, the same value is produced for a smaller amount of labor power, less has to be spent on labor power. So then the value of wages decrease, and all of a sudden you're back at the beginning. And when I'm talking about like the value of wages decrease, I'm talking about sort of like that real value of labor rather than nominal value, which would be the value in name. So maybe, you know, minimum wage has been $7 an hour for, you know, however many decades, but because of inflation, like the actual value of that, of how labor is being compensated is declining. Does that make sense? Cool. So then the third one is this contradiction between the, you know, quote unquote productive and reproductive spheres. Capitalism and capitalists rely on constant growth in order to be able to compete and survive. And so they're constantly looking for new non-commodified spheres to spread out into and commodify and try and earn a profit from. And so, we see that now with this service sector economy and reproduction being commodified, that capitalism is trying to expand out and subsume, the productive sphere is trying to subsume the reproductive sphere. And yet, the history of capitalism is predicated on having access to cheap reproductive labor. And reproductive labor isn't as cheap if it's wage labor, right? So there's this contradiction between wanting to expand and wanting to subsume these processes under the, formal economy, and yet the necessity to have access to reproduction cheaply in order to maintain this capitalist system. And finally, this contradiction between laboring subjects and self-actualization. So this is what you find on Google if you Google self-actualization, which I'm going to problematize later, but I just want to throw that up there for now. Capitalism necessitates that reproduction mold human beings into laboring subjects, into wage laborers, into people that are able to exist within capitalism, and yet people want to self-actualize, and in order to fully self-actualize, go beyond these limitations that capitalism puts on us, which I'll get more into in a minute. I'm going to dive back into these contradictions really soon when I talk about contradictions and strategy, but does anyone have any questions about any of the rest of it that I just said about the history? If not, I'll move on. Responding to crisis. I got this from this book that I passed around. One essay, this was in the same one that I referenced earlier, Without Reserve, by Mohandesi and Tiedelman, if I'm pronouncing both of those names correctly. I hope I am. But they say, they kind of end their essay with, here's some area of research that we didn't delve into but would be really awesome areas of research in the future. And kind of this hypothesis that they put forward is that this crisis of reproduction has seen three kind of predominant responses to it. The first is social democracy and the revitalization of the welfare state. So that's kind of calling for a return to this previous era of capitalism where social reproduction was to some degree subsidized by the capitalist state. The second is a return to right-wing populism, which ties well into the lecture from earlier today. This is predicated on emphasizing an idealized past where things were better, frequently white supremacy and the subjugation of women in this heteronuclear family, and this idea that, make America great again, it used to be great, these didn't used to be problems and we just need to go back to this previous era. And then this third response, which is personally my favorite, I don't know about you all, but they call it autonomous initiatives aiming to rebuild communal life. So I think that's kind of a lot of what we've been talking about all weekend, I hope. But I think this ties in really well of why this sort of reproductive framework can be integrated into sort of this social ecologist view, because in a lot of ways the goals and the conclusions it comes to can be very similar. Yeah.
I just have a question. I'm assuming you would include universal basic income in the welfare state social democracy sphere. But I'm just wondering.
I have a slide where I talk about that. I don't remember what it is, but very briefly. So if you want to.
Well, I'm just wondering if you couldn't also maybe, I think in the last. Could also maybe include it in autonomous initiatives aiming to rebuild communal life, because it could enable that type of work, right? So there's sort of some movement between the two.
Definitely. Yeah, I don't think this is by any means expansive. This was kind of, as I said, a hypothesis put forward by these two thinkers in this book, and so there's, we can definitely kind of complicate these and say, to what degree are these social democratic aims potentially making it easier for us to develop these autonomous initiatives, or maybe these three broad categories aren't the only ones. But yeah, thank you.
I think a fourth option that isn't on there, and is especially worrying to me, is a marriage of the first and the second.
Yeah.
What's happened in Poland, for example, like taking right-wing populism and a social protectionism from the market, embedding it in a Catholic nuclear family mold that's been wildly popular and successful, and I think other groups around Europe have taken it on, and that's worrisome.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Finland is also actually, they have a pretty strong right-wing movement right now.
Where?
In Finland.
Finland.
And one of my best friends is Finnish, and so his mom goes back, and she says like right now it's like very much they believe like the Finnish people are like a master race basically, like that is like a popular idea that you can just hear people talking about, and like they have very overt and explicit white supremacy and patriarchy that is like underlying their world-renowned socialist democracy.
True in Sweden and Denmark too. The
Yes.
right-wing populist parties are in ascendancy all over Europe, and they're not abandoning social democracy.
Yeah.
But they're limiting it. The immigrant. We don't want the immigrants to have.
Right, absolutely. So to return to these contradictions that I pointed out earlier, the first was this, endless need for endless accumulation of declining wages, and I think how that can inform us is this idea that these increased standards of living, standards of necessity, cannot only be won through, access to wages. There can't be just this compromise between the capitalist class and those working to say, subsidize our exploited labor a little bit better, be a little bit nicer to us, because we see through the economic logic of capitalism that doesn't actually work, and it actually backfires on us a lot of times, as seen in the second contradiction. The typical, the trade union organizing response is typically only equipped to fight against individual bosses or, small groups of bosses, and not equipped to confront capitalism in general a lot of time. I think, and they're very much contained within this dichotomy of operating within the productive sphere and ignoring the reproductive sphere. And I think something that we should be emphasizing is that what is referred to often as a boundary struggle, that's the boundary between production and reproduction. Whenever there's a crisis, there's a struggle over what belongs in this economic sphere and what belongs in this social, non-economic, non-wage sphere. And so engaging with those points of conflict, and oftentimes when something is removed from the economic sphere, it's devalued, and that's not good either. So trying to figure out how to engage in this boundary struggle over what belongs in what sphere and how these things are valued and compensated.
Wages for housework. Wages for housework.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that a little bit in a second.
Just, if I could add something, I think in terms of the contradiction of the standard of living and declining wages, wages are declining even more if you factor in the increased productivity and the extraction of surplus value. I mean, people are getting screwed every which way.
So then the next was this, the production versus reproduction, sort of this contradiction between the economic sphere constantly trying to expand to subsume reproduction and commodify reproduction. I think that what that tells us is we need to resist the commodification of socially reproductive labor power. It's not sufficient to try and say to maintain that being reproduced in the household, but also this that's been happening in the last several decades towards this commodification also needs to be resisted and struggled against. And we need to have a better understanding of what class means, what class struggle means, what the economy is, and recognize that these are terms that are defined within this framework of the productive economy. And potentially, I know within a lot of social ecology, there's this tendency to look beyond class and look at issues as not class-based issues. I personally am of the opinion that class is a category that's really important and should be talked about, but that it can't be the definition of class that Marx came up with 200 years ago. That it needs to be a more all-encompassing, holistic understanding of these complex social relations that exist within the workplace, yes, but also very much outside the workplace. And recognizing that all people that engage in exploited labor, this is kind of drawing back to your capitalism lecture of, capitalism. I am very much of the opinion that wage labor is necessary to capitalism, but it is clearly not sufficient, and capitalism is built off of all of these other forms of exploited labor as well, whether that be domestic labor in the household or slave labor, or any other sorts of labor relationships that aren't directly wage labor relationships. And finally, this contradiction of laboring subjects versus self-actualization. And I think, going back to that picture of person standing up all on their lonesome at the top of a cliff in a sunset or whatever, we need to question what self-actualization means outside of sort of a neoliberal individualist context. And what Bookchin talks about is these participatory social and political matrices, which are solely capable of facilitating this process of self-actualization. People don't exist in these isolated, individualized bubbles. We exist in this context of our social and political relationships. And it's only through building up these political and social systems that are actually truly participatory and democratic that people can self-actualize. That our current political systems and how we conceive of self-actualization is only serving to isolate us and individualize us and make it much harder to reproduce ourselves, both physically, biologically, and also socially. Does anyone have thoughts before I move forward? Questions? So then, overcoming contradiction, we see this, these multiple attempts in each of these kind of distinct stages of there being an attempt to diffuse the crisis. So I think we have to kind of be looking for what comes next, what is potentially going to be the winning strategy, not necessarily by us to not overcome this contradiction or transcend it, but just to diffuse crisis. Because we are in a period of crisis, and historically during periods of crisis, there is a reorganization, there is a shift, there is an attempt to diffuse. And so, I think you mentioned wages for housework earlier. That's something that was both engaged with and critiqued by social reproduction theorists at the time. Silvia Federici has an essay called Wages Against Housework. And, we don't want to just reinforce these existing gender hierarchies. We don't want to just bring social reproduction into the sphere of the wage economy because we're against wage work, right? There's these, mainstream liberal feminist struggles over, what's called work-life balance, where you balance your 8 hours a day at work and the rest of your life. And it's not, we can't just be struggling over that. We need to be struggling over completely overcoming and destroying this whole distinction between, the 8 hours a day we spend selling our souls to our bosses and the rest of our lives. And then UBI, which was brought up earlier, is, could potentially be that strategy for diffusing this struggle. We don't have enough money or time to reproduce ourselves, and so we'll, pay everyone $1,000 a month so that they can consume more and consume better. And that's still ultimately externalizing this process of reproduction to the market, and it's heavily dependent on the state to be benevolent enough to give us this money every month, which can very easily be taken away, could potentially be tied to, it's called universal basic income, but do prisoners get universal basic income? Do, undocumented people get universal basic income? Does X, Y, and Z group get universal basic income? So we have to question the degree to which, it's actually universal. And the degree to which, $1,000 a month today is not $1,000 a month 5 years from now. That nominal amount may stay the same, and yet just as we see wages declining, that universal income can likewise decline. And so I think being really wary of the ways in which universal basic income might be used as like a pressure valve to diffuse some of the conflict is something I want to put out there. And ultimately, we have to be questioning and thinking about what deep structural transformational change really looks like that's actually going to not just diffuse this crisis, but overcome these existing contradictions within our political economic system. And I think one solution to that is centering reproduction and how we understand the economy and our social and political movements. So something Bookchin talks a lot about is bringing the economy as a whole within the sphere, within the orbit of the public sphere, where economic policy can be like formulated and deliberated on and communally agreed to by entire communities. And so, like, I personally don't frame it in such a way as abolishing economic activity, which is kind of a framing that was thrown around yesterday. Like, I think, economic activity is something that's going to always exist. Maybe that's my bias as someone that's studied economics. But, however you frame it, these sorts of activities are, of producing food, or, we can problematize that language and say, we're growing food, we're, ditch this language of producing altogether, but whatever you call it, these processes are still going to happen, but they're just going to have to happen in radically different ways. And so right now, reproduction is instrumentalized towards the ends of production, because production is the part of the economy that's measured, is the part of the economy that generates capital, that maintains power in the hands of a particular class. But in a better world, in a world that's designed to meet human needs and actually fulfill this desire of self-actualization, I think that we could subsume productive activity towards the needs of reproduction, towards reproducing ourselves not just as capitalist subjects, but reproducing ourselves in a more holistic way that transcends that. And that has to go beyond the individualized family as well, not just beyond the market, but talking about really embedding our needs within this broader public responsibility. And then also just a little critique of workplace democracy thrown in here, maybe, with a question mark, is that a lot of this movement towards cooperatization of the economy and building co-ops also still reinforces this division between production and reproduction. And so, something that Bookchin talks about and puts forward is, replacing the concept of this economic democracy with a public democracy where these decisions are embedded within the broader needs of the community, and trying to break down that division between, when you're a worker and when you're a consumer. And that is also harkening back to Peter's lecture yesterday. You can't just divide yourself into I'm a worker during these hours today and a consumer during these hours of the day. And that is a capitalist logic that's been put forward. And to the extent that the left is buying into that division, into that logic, we're buying into I think a capitalist lie that's been reinforced and sold to us over the past several hundred years. So this is my last slide, and then maybe, I don't know how much time we have. I'm 3 minutes over, so I'll be fast. So I just wanted to throw out some, I think, so this was more kind of like a vision of what does this mean for a broader strategic orientation, and then maybe a little bit more specifically, what are some concrete ways that this takes form. So one way I think is tenants organizing. That's something that I'm involved a lot with locally in Olympia. Resistance to gentrification, to increase rents, to resistance to privatized utilities, and other things that affect cost of living. Struggles over education and childcare. So that's there's a lot of labor organizing of teachers in public education right now, which is both a struggle over wages, but also a struggle over the curriculum in public schools and how our students are taught and what they're taught, which is really, I think, in a way, bridging a gap between reproductive and workplace struggles. Maybe not sufficiently, but that's a really interesting area that I'm engaged in. There's also popular education, so education outside of the formal economic structures, formal state structures, like what we're doing here this weekend, this week, reading groups, etc., and then childcare outside of the commodified forms of childcare. I think also anti-police, anti-prison, and communal defense is a form of organizing that can center this kind of social reproduction in a way, to the extent that it keeps our neighborhoods safe from violent forces that want to attack us, from whether that be from the police or from racist, fascist violence or whatever else. We need to be able to have safe communities in order to reproduce ourselves. Then there's communal or municipal infrastructure, so I'm talking about transportation infrastructure, public transportation. That's a struggle that exists currently kind of as a struggle between social movements and existing municipal structures. And then there's communal institutions, which can take the form of either co-opting or influencing existing ones or trying to build your own, but these communal institutions can be healthcare institutions, mutual aid institutions, any sorts of institutions that seek to provide access to social reproduction in a communal way that anyone can participate in and have access to. And I think through this sort of communal institution building that seeks to meet our human needs, we're hopefully reopening up this public sphere and public participation in a way that it gives people the power to engage in their communities directly and make decisions within their communities effectively, and help grow the consciousness of people that there are these other ways to organize things. And so while maybe your group that you're just starting up that seeks to community garden or whatever else that is trying to provide these resources isn't going to be sufficient at first. It's not going to provide for the entire community, but it can provide the basis of people learning to exist outside of these spheres of social reproduction that currently exist and we have access to. So that's all I have to say about that.
That was great, thank you.
Thank you.